Recording and transcription have started. Apparently
it worked because we're recording. It's
now we're
the
recording.
Corner of
Yeah.
1:30, whatever.
Yeah. All right.
Good job.
Still waiting.
Yeah, Brian, you were able to start it.
I
He
have
has all the
power.
Strange. All right. Well, we have indicated that we are recording. It is 10:01 by computer clock. The meeting is able to begin if you all would like it to.
I think we need to wait.
Yeah, I'd like to give another minute for Valerie to come on. She is. Hey, Valerie.
Morning.
So I'll start off briefly here. As everyone knows, this is a brand new board. So we're gonna, today this meeting is, a little bit useful, if confusing for everybody. You got like 50 agendas. But it's because we're going to have a little bit of growing pains about starting this brand new board. And the first reason for the revision in the agenda was because we were told by the clerk of the board, like all the other board meetings, advisory committee, et cetera, we have to do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh, you're doing it.
So I don't know if somebody's, maybe Joe, do we have something we can pledge allegiance to?
I could try to find something real quick.
I know our advisory committee chair has a flag. I don't know if it's at your fingertip, John.
Well,
I've got one if you don't.
I've got one. I'll share.
Okay.
Everybody should see that, I think, now, right?
Yes.
All right. So if we can do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So the second agenda item is to elect a chairman. And I'll start off by saying I appreciate the extra time. You guys committed to one meeting a month, and now you guys are stuck at a second meeting a month. So I already appreciate that. Is there someone who's willing to stand up to be a chairman for the infrequent number of times we will have these meetings? And
keeping in mind, this is the first time we've had one since we adopted this ordinance in what, 2017?
15, I think.
15. So it's been
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
frequency wouldn't be high, and I appreciate that John has unsilenced himself, because I was going to suggest you're the chair of the advisory committee. Maybe that there's logic in extending that, but go ahead, John.
Well, what I was going to say is that I am not sure what my plans are for the larger committee going forward, so I might not be the best candidate for this position, for chair.
Okay. I don't know about everybody else, but John sounded like he was in witness protection to me.
Yeah, no, it sounds like that's you too. He's very buzzy.
Yeah.
Something's going on with the microphone or something.
Chris?
Chris, you look
I
like you
raised
had your
my
hand up, Chris Langham.
I did. I'm the designated felon quite often, so
You're going to
I'd be
nominate
willing
yourself?
if no one else is hearing.
Very much appreciated. I guess can the other 5 members suggest their concurrence by voting aye on Chris Langham to be the
Well, I
chair?
guess you actually need a nomination for him, correct?
All right, he nominated himself, but you nominate, John.
I will nominate Chris Langham as chair of this committee.
Is there a second?
I will second.
Very good. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. First official action of
Thank
the
you
Board
all.
of Hearing Review. I guess this is so that was a little bit, out of, this one will be the least normal agenda because we had an elected chairman, but now it's the call to order essentially. And so, Chris can take over the rest of the agenda.
Oh, man. Yes.
You already-
Me and my Robert's Rules of Order are a little foggy. So I call this meeting of the first meeting of the Flood Control District Board of Hearing Review on Monday, November 15th to order.
Thank you.
Okay.
Next agenda item.
We are to hear the appeal for Green Things Incorporated, but they've requested a continuance to a December meeting.
Right. So technically, our attorney says that the agreement to continue is actually a decision you make. We're supportive of the continuance as, one party of this, the folks completing the enforcement action. Green Things, as the appellant requested the appeal, requested the continuance. We're okay with that, but that decision actually falls on you guys. So this would be another vote about whether or not you're okay with the continuance.
So, Mr. Chair, point of order, I guess I'd like to ask, what if we chose not to grant a continuance?
Then we would hear it. There was the risk, and we had spoken with Green Things attorney, and we said that while that's completely at your discretion to hear this today, and you have all of the documentation, I don't think you'll hear much new because we handed you all the background information. We'll talk about the process a little bit more in a subsequent agenda item. But you have all the information in front of you. But we did say that since we're concurring, the likelihood is that you would go along with both parties. But the fact of the matter is you could decide to hear it today anyway.
Can I ask a question? This might be answered in the next agenda items, but when I looked through the packet, it appeared that they have somebody like an architect doing work, and so I'm assuming maybe their request for the continuance is related to the fact that they're going through the building permitting process to repair whatever, or repair whatever mistakes they made. So it seems fair to give them time if they're taking steps to make this okay.
I appreciate you bringing that up. And the answer is yes, they do have a concurrent path that your documents, they do have Seaver Franks who are working with Green Things. And they have a concurrent path, but they are trying to figure out how to get in compliance. concurrent with appealing the hearing officer's decision and the chief engineer's final decision order. So there are kind of parallel paths going, to your point, yes.
It should be said, we don't expect any real resolution by the time, you know, of the 21 days that they're asking for continuance. It's unlikely that, you know, any complete plan for resolution would be in place by then.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out what compliance means.
I'm assuming also like I know that like building permitting and floodplain are separate but happen together. So 21 days is not enough usually for the building permitting process to be completed or anything. And so, but it may be enough time to have their architects get a substantial amount of work done and have a clearer picture of how long they need and what they're doing. So I would imagine they're going to ask us for more time after the 21 days anyway.
It's possible if it looks like there's a path where at least there's an understanding of what compliance means, and then we're just following the building permitting process. There's value in that too, for sure. And that's where we are. They're at the is this sufficient? Is that sufficient? And this is with respect essentially to the construction of the new buildings that happened without permits. They're trying to figure out, what an alternative new building looks like.
And I think building permitting won't issue a final permit until the floodplain process is done anyway.
We have a pretty good internal process for, marrying the floodplain use permit to the building permit. We're essentially under the umbrella of a building permit.
And one thing I would add too is, the appeal is of the decision. Once, if you as the Board of Hearing Review decides that, the flood control district is, you decide in favor of the flood control district, it won't really be necessarily the Board of Hearing Review's job to keep following up. It just keeps us back onto our enforcement process where, we will be giving them appropriate amounts of time to achieve compliance. Your main goal is to decide whether to uphold the decision of the chief engineer or side with the appellant, and at what point, we basically are hands off at that point. So it's not really the role of in my understanding, the role of the Board of Hearing Review you're not going to be saying you have 60 days to comply. That will be the flood control district's job once you have decided whether or not to uphold the decision of the chief engineer or not.
Question.
Just to clarify though, that decision, like upholding what the flood control just said, like department says, we're just granting them time to figure out their stuff right now. We're not making any sort of decision on their argument, right?
So your task, and we'll get into this in a later agenda item, is to, they've appealed the hearing officer's decision and the chief engineer's final decision and order, and your role is to either reauthorize, affirm the hearing officer's decision, deny the decision, or modify the decision. So you do have some liberties in kind of charting a new path, as it were. But that's what your role would be. You would look at the hearing officer's, conclusions, and essentially we did not add to that, to the hearing officer's decision, but you could make changes to that. And the hearing officer's decision is submit an application for a floodplain use permit for all buildings within 6 weeks and obtain a floodplain use permit, either new or revisited, to reflect actual building use and comply with all terms within 6 months. So that is something you could affirm, deny, or modify.
And the time I think mostly that the time that they've requested for the continuance is really part of their reasoning is they have a new lawyer that they're trying to get up to speed, and they're trying to, we had a response to their appeal, and they want to respond to that response essentially. So they wanted time to prepare that. So I don't think, in my head, they're not saying that within 21 days they're going to have a complete picture of how they're going to comply. They're just looking for more time to organize
the alternate argument that they don't need these permits, I think.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully through their own process, they'll discover that they do need the permits, and they should have gotten them from the beginning.
Right.
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I was reading the November 8th letter from Green Things, and it says, Pima County's response raises new issues and additional time is needed in order to adequately respond. I'm not aware of any new issues that could, at least not from the literature I saw that the county has raised. Do you know what that's in reference to?
No, I believe that is the rationale to request a continuance and the validity of such rationale. I think that we gave them new specific information regarding the improvement. They were trying to make the equivalency that their work was similar to the work we did in Brandy Fenton Park, and we gave them new information to say that it wasn't. But I don't believe it's any new concept or any new. It's really a continuation of the same thought. So I think that they're trying to buy time to make a different. I don't know if it's a different argument or if time just works on their side generally. Again, we were supportive of this partly because this is a brand new board and there's a lot of procedural kind of housekeeping things that there was value in meeting without necessarily having to hear a case at the same time. 21 days is, this has been a long process with Green Things. Another 21 days isn't the end of the world. It's one more meeting for you guys, and appreciate again your willingness to do that. But beyond that, this creates an opportunity to kind of do a little bit of housekeeping on how this whole thing works, separate from also hearing a case.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
How do these get going in the first place? Was there someone who called in an issue of non-compliance, or is it just that the inspectors go out occasionally and inspect these commercial properties, or how did it all come about?
It's a good question. And so it's, inevitably, you may hear cases that follow a few paths, including frequently somebody applies for a permit and we realize when doing our site review that other improvements have been made that have not been permitted. And then we start saying, hey, all these other things require permits. Sometimes we'd see by observation, but frequently it is, neighbors being worried about a new improvement that's going on and its compatibility with the floodplain ordinance. In this particular case, I believe it was actually it was a neighbor complaint related to additional retail use. So the complicating factor in this case, in addition to the floodplain issues, is the expansion of the retail use.
I also assume that given more time, like the Seaver Frank, they're very qualified architects, and if they have a new lawyer, maybe they didn't like what the last lawyer was doing, but through Seaver Frank's work moving forward, they will ideally, point out the issue, like the process is the process with the city and you didn't do it, so here's what we need to do to fix that. And I assume that by the end of going through that with the architects and even their new lawyer, they'll discover that they need to comply, whether.
We have had meetings with Seaver Franks. And we've had at least 2 meetings with them, and it seems to me that they do understand that there is a solution going forward, and the real solution is to bring everything into compliance, and they are working to try to get their client into that same thinking.
Right.
Hey, folks, I guess I'm addressing this question to staff. Nothing I've seen in the information that Tammy sent or in the responses from Green Things attorney, nothing in that has suggested to me that they intend to bring these buildings into compliance. Is that your impression as well, Eric and Brian?
Good question. So, and this, you know, that became a legal question because there is, you know, we're reading, and again, I'll talk about this briefly, or we'll talk about it now, and I can fast forward some of that later on. Is we're looking at our rules of procedure for hearing officer for Board of Hearing Review, and essentially the information you will see is what the hearing officer got to see and the chief engineer got to see. There is a whole separate track where they're talking about bringing these buildings into compliance, and there's been no permits issued. We've talked about, you know, what that might look like. It's very complicated because particularly you would know, John, we have issues of commercial use versus residential use versus storage, and whether or not you can be wet flood proofed or dry flood proofed or elevated. And so there's a lot of conversations on the sideline that were never submitted to the hearing officer, and so you don't see that, but there is a whole parallel track of what getting into compliance means. And we perceive that you know, if you have the site plan nearby, there are some new buildings, and the new buildings essentially get replaced with other new buildings that are built in compliance. And then there were permitted storage buildings that may be allowed to remain as storage, but that's really a use discussion. That's a zoning discussion and not a building discussion. But it really feels like, you know, there's a concerted effort to take the new, obviously new buildings and compliance means essentially rebuilding them elevated.
And I suspect that, you know, obviously they're hoping for success with their appeal, and that they don't have, and, you know, maybe they have to deal with some stuff, but not everything. But I think, you know, while they're working on solutions, the impression I got is that, you know, they're hoping not to have to bring some of these things into compliance because they're hoping that their appeal will be successful. Obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have appealed. But they, you know, they do have some plans for making things compliant, and we've had discussions with Seaver Franks about what would have to happen with each building in order to make them compliant. So, you know, certainly their Green Things, you know, contractors know what needs to be done for the most part. I would say, I think they're fully understanding of what needs to be done. It's just that they're not proceeding too far down the road because they don't want to develop full plans. If their appeal is successful, then that's wasted time and effort. So I think they're moving down that track, but not at a high rate of speed, just because they don't want to do work that they don't have to if their appeal is upheld.
Okay. And
Understandable.
it's been a very long time since I've sat in your chair, Eric. Correct me if I'm wrong. We are not the final arbiters. This can go to the Board of Supervisors sitting as the district board.
Interestingly enough, this process goes to court after you, and so you are not the final arbiters, but it ends up in Superior Court. The compliance element actually avoids going to the Board of Directors. It goes right to court after this.
Is that different than it was back in the 90s?
So what it is, it's really, you know, it's a convoluted setup. It depends on the set of paths you take. For example, if they apply for a floodplain use permit and we deny a floodplain use permit, that ends up in front of the Board of Directors. Because we're in this compliance avenue, we used to have to go right to court. And now we have the hearing officer, the imposition of penalties, Board of Hearing Review, and then court. So we've added some steps to get to court if it was just a specific compliance issue, and the ability to add penalties. So there are a few avenues that end up in front of the Board of Directors, but this particular path that we're on at the moment goes to Superior Court after this.
Interesting. All right, thanks.
I don't know if this is helpful, but when I read the report, it seems like there's a few things. There's a historic building and site issue. There's a zoning compliance and use issue. And then there's the floodplain issue. And the language that they're using, greens and things, it's like they're operating as if they're on agricultural land, which would mean that they don't have to get building permits for everything, but they would still have to follow FEMA regulations. So I'm kind of like, what is the difference between us and FEMA?
We're the local implementers of the National Flood Insurance Program, and then we get audited by FEMA at a certain frequency where they will look at all new development in the FEMA floodplain. And so we're the local legs. Actually, there's ADWR, the state is in between, and they're doing compliance audits of us. But we're the boots on the ground people, and so we're implementing the National Flood Insurance Program. Our ordinance meets the National Flood Insurance Program plus additional rules. They encourage local jurisdictions to do above and beyond the minimum of the NFIP, but at a minimum, we're doing the NFIP. So we're FEMA in this regard.
So if they were to, in order to remediate their building and historic issues, if they were to go through a rezoning process and try to rezone this property as agricultural, would that eliminate us from their process and send them straight to?
I don't think so. I think there are some exemptions for ag uses. They're mostly for the non-building ag uses. As soon as you do buildings, particularly if you're doing retail, the FEMA requirements apply.
Okay.
Yeah. And I would say too, their argument of historic use, and even the retail use, they seem to be misapplying those rules in that, an historic use of the property doesn't mean you can build any building on the property you want to, just because it's an historic property or an historic location. Likewise with the retail, the commercial side of things, just because they have permission to do retail work there doesn't mean that they can build anything they want to on that property, and they seem to be thinking that those are carte blanche permissions for them to do whatever they want to do.
Well, giving them the extra time might give their architects and lawyer time to re-educate them in a way.
We can only hope, right?
Yeah.
We can hope. I know that they've been talking, both the lawyer, my perspective is both the lawyer and Sieber Franks have been talking to the owners and explaining the historic designation. There's no correlation between the modified uses of the actual historic buildings on Brandy Fenton and what they're doing in the historic Bingham historic landscape. There's not an equivalency there, and at the moment, I don't think the owners are getting that, and they didn't. Certainly, that was the hearing officer's perspective, that they don't get that, and so maybe perhaps they'll have more success. Perhaps it will take at the next meeting, presuming you continue this, where that you guys get to have that discussion too. But yeah, I think that the owner is got all the eggs in the basket of I'm a historic use.
I feel compelled to give them the extension now and wait and see what they come up with after their process with architects and lawyers.
Is that a motion?
Yes, that is a motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Favor? Yep.
Aye.
1, 2, 3,
All right.
4. Motion
Thank
carried,
you.
it looks like.
All right, what's the next agenda item?
Hearing dates for calendar year 2022.
Yeah, so this is a discussion item. I'm not exactly sure how you guys want to do this. Again, as Brian pointed out, we've had these rules of procedure for a very, very long time already. And their hearing officer process has been working astoundingly well. The issuance of penalties has been very successful. And this is in 6 years, the first time we've actually had a Board of Hearing review. However, because this is a learning time frame, it got a little bit chaotic trying to convene a meeting, meet the open meeting law criteria, and schedule times and whatnot. And so this is a discussion item regarding whether or not we want to have kind of a slated calendar of dates for recurrent hearings, like once per month, just to have them available in the event that somebody does appeal a hearing officer, and then we just spend most of the time canceling dates. There's a lot of Board of Adjustments. There's lots of boards that do these, have just kind of a slated calendar, and then we just cancel until we need it, or we can do it more ad hoc based on need. And so that's really a discussion for you guys about, so we don't get through the chaos. It felt chaotic inside the flood control district trying to wrangle a meeting time.
Yeah, I think that if you have ad hoc meeting time like this, the problem you run into is getting polls out to see when everybody can meet. Whereas if you have one time set up, then it's just blocked off on your calendar, knowing you're going to do that.
Yes. So if that's your inclination, I will add one small wrinkle. I don't think it's a big wrinkle. The statute, and therefore our ordinance and our procedures, says, and this will kind of move into the next agenda item, says there will be a hearing, and then you guys have to take an action, and we're happy to take the actions for you. You're volunteering your time, but you need to come up with findings of fact and conclusions of law. And so what we will do is we will interpret your guys' decisions at a hearing, or we'll presume we'll do this, and then write up a report for you. And then you have to have this report completed in 30 days. And so to me, if we set up hearing dates that are just 30 days apart, you can vote on the previous month's hearings at the next meeting, in meeting the 30-day time frame. If that's reasonable for you, we'll just set meetings on essentially 30 days from each other. Did that make sense, what I was trying to say?
It makes sense to me, Eric. I'm wondering, is there anything in the statutory creation of this board that obligates it to meet monthly?
No, just that you need to meet. We need to meet for a hearing, and then you need to have a report 30 days, and that's 30 business days. So that's good. After the hearing, once the hearing is closed, your decision needs to be complete within 30 days.
So I have a question about that.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Brian. So if someone appeals, do you have to have this board meet within a certain period of time, like 30 days from the appeal?
That it's a great discussion. This is why we were kind of appreciating a pre-meeting before a hearing. So here's the board shall issue a written order of its decision, including findings of fact and conclusions of law, and shall submit its final written order on the matter to the chief engineer within 30 days after completion of the hearing. So that's it. So everything else is set. I think you guys can figure out how that works.
Well, so maybe one of the things like John was alluding to is just we set up quarterly meetings, and then if we do have a hearing, then at the hearing, the next meeting that within that 30-day time frame is set up.
I am fine with that. I believe that the timeframes work out. Once somebody appeals, there are a few clocks that are set into motion, but I don't believe that it violates the, the Board of Hearing Review will set a time and date for hearing to review the matter. Our ordinance says if there's appeal, similar to the documents you receive, you get an appeal, we write a report, they can, the appellant can respond to the report, and then we can do a final report or a revised report. And all those things have little clocks that move along, but we can, I think, set the date for whatever that next quarterly meeting is. Again, presuming after 6 years, we've only had one of these, that feels totally doable. And that sounds great to me that at the same meeting, we just put on the agenda, follow up, approve final report. So, this would be agenda item 1 would be hearing, agenda item 2 is approve written report of decision. And then again, the district can do the labor with the report. We can take the minutes and the discussion and come up with that report. And I don't think it's going to be a highly technical or very complex report. If you've seen the hearing officer's report, and if you've seen the final decision of the chief engineer, they're form-like. They have some regulatory language and a conclusion. I think it's going to look like that. You just have to vote on it.
Eric, that document you were just displaying, is that something we've received in one of our packages?
I think it was a link to, I might have put in a link in an email, or maybe Tammy did, but they're available on our, if you go to the rules part of our, if you go to ordinance, there is the rules of administrative procedure in enforcing floodplain management regulations. That it's in there, adopted 2014.
Yeah, I see it here.
Yeah, and then there is, the actual ordinance language, which is equally vague, talks about the Board of Hearing Review, but it says, interestingly enough, here it says 30 calendar days, but that's fine if we're going to vote on, the day, we have a hearing and then you're going to vote within 30 calendar days of approving the report. Otherwise, the language is very similar. So there's two fairly vague descriptions of what this process looks like.
All right. This is not directly related to the current agenda item, but relevant, I guess. If we hold this hearing on, what is that, the 13th that they asked for the continuance to?
Right.
Is there any reason to think that we would meet more than that one time?
I think that we will set an agenda on the 13th hearing where you will need to vote on the date, another date within 30 days to approve the final report.
Oh, I'm seeing, okay. But not to extend.
A hearing equates to another meeting, essentially. And that's not the only way to do that. I think that there are other ways to skin the cat as far as for you approving a report, but it gets, the open meeting laws really kind of get in the way, as it were, because, you guys shouldn't be discussing offline the report outside of an open meeting issue. And so the idea is we would draft a report based on, the minutes of the hearing, and we're hopeful you can make a decision right after the hearing and feed us some stuff, and then we'll write up a report, but then you all come back together and vote on it. If you do that separately, you're making legal decisions, and then we start violating the open meeting law stuff. So we can't. It feels like the easiest way is just meet quickly and vote on it.
Eric, is it possible during a regular advisory committee meeting to have the Board of Hearing Review sit separately and take action? That way it's already scheduled.
I would say that we we could set the hearings to be right after the advisory committee meeting at some time certain, if we wanted quarterly meetings to do that. And then the next, we could certainly line it up with advisory committee. And then, everybody leaves that meeting and goes right into another meeting. It has to be at a time certain though, because there's going to be an appellant. But that's certainly, Joe is trying not to gum up all your calendar more than. So that's certainly that way. If you already were blocking off a morning, that could be those kind of mornings.
And we'll just make a quick comment, what Eric was saying about the open meetings laws, it is definitely important that you guys don't have side conversations outside of the meetings regarding these. Because that will get us into trouble if discovered, so.
Understood.
Yeah, I mean, the advisory committee is that too, but as you guys know, the advisory committee is less weighty than this kind of thing. That's that you're making, you're helping us in the compliance enforcement scene. Our advisory committee is mostly sharing of info, which tends to not necessarily matter for the open meeting stuff necessarily. But now that we're in the legal environment, that works.
Understood.
So I heard a motion from Ann, or she didn't form it as that necessarily. Maybe it's a discussion point for quarterly meetings. I'll add right after advisory committee at Joe's request, and maybe if that's okay with everybody, somebody want to make a motion on that?
I can make that motion that we have quarterly meetings that are scheduled to follow advisory board meetings.
I'll second that.
All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Passes.
Excellent. Thank you guys, and for agreeing to further gum up your calendars.
No problem.
So agenda item 6 is intent.
Do we want to do that at like the beginning of court, actual fiscal quarter, like a yearly quarter, or quarterly doesn't have to be January, whatever. It could be whatever month. But do we want, for ease, do you want to make it January, April, July, October for the beginning of quarters for the year?
My preference would be not January, not July, because those are really tough months. But I can make it work if that's everybody else's preferences.
Chris Langham, just for Robert's Rules of Order, since a motion and a second have already been taken, I believe that you as the chair need to reopen the discussion if you are amending a motion or setting a time frame.
We will reopen this so we can ultimately set this. Yes.
And Anne,
Thank
you will
Joe.
need to restate your motion as amended then for the record.
Okay, can we have the conversation of when people would prefer to have the quarterly meetings set up?
To your point, if you do March, June, September, December, those are drier.
When that could work, because we will be meeting in December just to start.
Yeah.
Should we pick those?
Okay, so I make a motion to have quarterly meetings in the months that Eric just stated.
Starting in March.
Starting in March, that would follow the advisory board meetings.
Excellent.
I will second that.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right.
Unanimous.
Nailed that down. So we hit on topic agenda item 6 quite a bit already. And so I don't necessarily have too much more to say. I think I shared with you there are three regulatory areas where we're looking for guidance on the Board of Hearing Review, and it's the statute, and then our floodplain management ordinance 1664-070, which is similar but not identical to the statute, and then there's the procedures for the Board of Hearing Review. That is a separate appendix to our floodplain management ordinance, which is not exact but similar, and so they're all saying very similar things. And I think that what everything we're doing right now is, definitely meets those criteria. I think the important issues to me were, make sure we follow those rules and procedures, making sure we have a good time frame for making decisions, and then meeting again in 30 days. So I think we handled most of those, and you probably have already seen it, but maybe let me see if I can find it very quickly. When Tammy sent that whole packet, buried inside of that was the hearing officer's decision. I would imagine that we would develop a form, before, in between now and the meeting for your report to we'll gin up a form very similar that includes your role, identifies it as your report, and we will listen to what you guys talk about, and we will write up the final decision of the Board of Hearing Review, and that's the thing that gets approved or modified by you guys. And again, we're going to start off with what the hearing officer and the chief engineer said, and they say the same things because we just agree with the hearing officer for the most part. It compels a penalty, it compels compliance by a certain time frame, and then you guys have the liberty to just affirm that, modify that, or reject that. And so, those are the things we want to hear so that we know how to write your final report. But we'll do all that heavy lifting, and then you can just give a thumbs up or tell us where to amend it, and then give a thumbs up, and it'll be part of the amended record. That's what would happen 30 days following. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Are there other questions you guys might have? Otherwise, we've exhausted the things I was going to talk about on that topic. Are there other questions you have about this?
I just really need to read through.
Well, I don't know. Can we? I don't want to hold the whole hearing right now, but nothing I saw in the packet suggested to me that there was a way around at least one or more of these buildings being elevated. Am I wrong about that?
That is the hearing officer's decision, was essentially to bring the buildings into compliance, and the non-compliance was they are not elevated, or frankly for commercial uses dry flood proof. But again, John, that nobody does that in this town.
Right.
So essentially it's elevation. They could propose dry flood proofing, but really the only game in town is elevating. So yes, certainly our position is the new buildings need to be elevated or dry flood proofed as commercial uses.
Can I ask two questions? First of all, what is dry flood proofing? And
yes,
and yeah, I guess answer that first.
And again, Robert's Rules of Order, please keep this discussion general and not pertaining to green things, because it is not advertised on the agenda.
Great recommendation. So so to be general, there are 3 different types of uses that allow for different mitigation in compliance with FEMA standards. So the highest and best use is residential use, and all buildings need to be elevated to above the base flood elevation and in the state of Arizona, it's 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Commercial uses, non-residential uses, are allowed to be dry flood proofed, which means their lowest floor is below base flood elevation or the 1 foot above in Arizona, but are rendered watertight, meaning the walls are resistant to flood forces, they don't collapse. That means there's gasketed doors or other ways to keep water out. So it's essentially, the interior is dry but underwater. All, surrounding it, and that's very difficult to do in Arizona because rubber doesn't work really well. There's operational issues. Somebody has to go put a little gate or something, and so I'm only aware of 1 dry flood proof place in all of Pima County, including the city of Tucson. And then there is a less restrictive standard for a very limited class of uses that are parking of vehicles, garages essentially, storage,
Limited storage, I would add.
Actually the statute just says storage, but everyone uses limited, and building entryways, think like mudrooms, that can be wet floodproof, which is essentially designed with materials to resist flooding, but with openings to let the water in. So the interior of your garage gets wet, all your electrical receptacles are above the base flood elevation. Obviously, you'd want to store things above there. So the flood comes, the interior gets wet, it's all flood resistant material, so you're just sweeping out mud, but there is very little damage because you've designed it that way. And so those are the 3 classes. And a commercial use compliance is those top 2, which is what dry flood proofing or elevating. And part of the discussion in that we're talking about is the difference between the use and whether or not wet flood proofing is compliant.
Have you ever seen or heard of alternative methods of creating different sorts of landscape elements to draw water away from buildings?
We do. So that's a great point, and I'll stay general in this. We have local floodplains that you can do mitigation to essentially dry up the land around a building. You can put it on a fill pad and that elevates it, but you can build a levee-like structure, a berm that moves water around and dries up the interior, and that would be satisfactory. You could even possibly do that in some FEMA floodplains where we don't have base flood elevations known, because then would be a local community's prerogative to make sure a structure is dry. You wouldn't change the floodplain map per se, but you would be able to show it's dry. In this particular case, these folks are in a floodplain that has water surface elevations. And so, in order for them to show that their improvements are dry, they then have to talk to FEMA and say, I'm lowering the water surface elevation. So you could practically dry it all up, but they're still in the FEMA floodplain with those base flood elevations. So if you look at buildings and the elevation of a building and where the water surface is, though, unless you talk to FEMA and get those to change, you're going to look like you're a non-compliant structure. And the effort to get FEMA to make that change, you have to build levees, and that's a Herculean task that I think is.
They would have to get a letter of map revision in order to do that, essentially. And any levee-like structure would have to be certified as a levee, which means you got a high engineering cost and you've got ongoing maintenance issues as well. So
that's on them, but it may be more cost effective and certainly less risky just to build these things in compliance. Start again. But that's on them.
And so just to reiterate again, if part of their issue right now is the use of the buildings. So technically they could also say, sorry, we made the mistake, and I guess what our remediation plan is not to use those buildings for what we said we were going to. And
It
they're all
is.
garages now.
It could be, and we've now moved away. So why this one's complicated is we've moved away from a floodplain issue kind of to a allowable use, and so all of a sudden our zoning people, get into the fray there about what is reasonable storage.
Yeah, but certainly in general, when speaking generally, we certainly have cases where someone builds a building with an intended use. Usually it's residential, usually it's habitable. They do that without a permit, and basically as a part of reaching compliance, they have to convert that habitable structure into an uninhabitable structure. So they convert their little casita into a storage building, essentially. So they're changing the use to a use that would allow wet flood proofing. And then they can correct it without having to elevate the floor of the structure. So that is a potential solution in many of these cases, is to change the use. It doesn't mean they don't have to do something to fix. It doesn't mean they don't have work to do potentially, because they might still have to, replace
Flood resistant materials.
They might have to replace materials with flood resistant materials. They're going to have to punch holes in the walls of the building for to meet the federal statutes. But it would be a lighter lift than having to raise the entire structure up to the regulatory flood elevation.
And to your earlier point, we're under the umbrella of a building permit, and so zoning has to believe their storage.
So under our umbrella, is there some process that could, like, I guess in the event that they said, no, we're just going to change the use, is it zoning's purview, or is it us to maybe request an inspection a year out or something to ensure that
it could be either or both? It's a good question, and I think it could be either or both. And again, without getting too close to the particular thing, it's a commercial entity, so anybody can go on any weekend and buy a tree and see what the use is, right?
I just wonder if we have the authority to rule with something like that. Like, we'll accept it under the condition that you get annual floodplain inspections or something like that.
So I think the concepts there, we issue permits, for example, with mitigation that requires folks to report to us every year for 5 years. So I mean, the concepts there that the permit isn't the end of a activity. We can confirm an ongoing activity. So it could be us, and it again, it could be zoning in the retail use. We just know that the retail use side is they have their own definition of storage versus warehouse.
Yeah. And basically, if you as the board attorney wanted to do something like that, it would be basically what we could do is basically it would be part of the conditions of the permit. So we would issue a floodplain use permit, and a condition of the permit would be, annual inspections of, the facility to make sure that it is still in compliance with the conditions of the permit.
All right, and then I have one last question, and it is particular to this case potentially, but so there's issues around the actual buildings. Are there also issues with the water affecting properties around it, adjacent properties?
Great question. And we do have the authority and frequently ask to make sure that proposed improvements are built to be free from damage during the base flood, the 100-year flood, and to make sure that those improvements don't harm others during the base flood. And we have standards for what that means. And in this particular case, we don't apply that all the time. We apply it, at our discretion when we think that there's a concern. And the violations that you see in front of you, and do not bring up the requirement to do that. The land is big enough, and the floodplain conditions are such that we haven't said you also must demonstrate these things. We're really focusing on the buildings themselves.
That's a curiosity for me. Generally speaking, there is a probably 2011 FEMA firm map, and I know that there has been a lot of more updated analysis, and I'm curious if they are equivalent. You know, if we're dealing with regulatory depths that are equivalent to perhaps some other studies.
We're using the effective firm for the Rito flooding, and we're using the Finger Rock recent study we completed for the Finger Rock depths.
Yeah, so the Rito has not been restudied, and that's actually an option that we gave to, in this case, is you could try to demonstrate that the FEMA floodplain is not accurate, which there is some reason to believe that it's not. But they basically determined that was going to be too expensive to
And risky. You might look and
it might actually be worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or insufficiently better, right?
Yeah.
Question for staff. During the actual hearing next month, will we be able to query staff for information, specific ordinance citations, that sort of thing?
Thank you. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a really important thing to bring up. The way that we plan for the hearing to go would be, you already have the documentation. The first part would be the appellant gets to say whatever the appellant wants to say, and then the second part would be staff goes through the information that was provided and probably gloss over it, since we've kind of had this kind of conversation, and then there would be an opportunity for you to question the appellant, and then for you to question staff. So it would be in that order. Them first, then us.
All right, thanks. Mr.
Yeah,
Chair, I think you're welcome to call for a motion to adjourn.
That's right.
I do. I put forward a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
We appreciate your guys' time and sincerity in the review of these. These are weightier than the typical advisory committee stuff, and so we appreciate your attention to these particular projects. And partly, we saw an opportunity to the Board of Hearing Review has been out there as a potential for a whole bunch of years, and actually constituting it and getting through that is something that was of an interest to us, and we appreciate that you're going along this with us. And I feel a lot better. It felt like a little bit of a black hole going into this meeting, but I think that now that we've been able to talk about it as a group, while I'm sure there'll be little hiccups or bumps here and there as we kind of refine the process, that the fact that we're all agreeing to what that might look like in December was very helpful to me. So appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
All
folks.
right.
Do your day.
So,
See you next
have a
month.
good one.
See y'all next month.